In this video, I want to give an overview of the inspector, which is this great big tall panel that is pretty much eating up the entire right-hand side of your screen if you happen to be in the default wide layout. Now, generally speaking, Lee, what is the inspector? What's it going to do for us?
Well, the inspector is a context-sensitive window that actually shows us properties that can be adjusted depending on what we have selected.
Now, that's the big critical thing to keep in mind with the inspector, the context sensitivity of it. As we select different things, the information we see here is going to update and change. So here I happen to have this camp prefab selected, and so we get a certain set of properties. However, if I was to select, say, this fire sound object that is sitting at the top of our campfire, everything in here updates to show us the properties for that. So your inspector is going to take on a lot of different forms while you use it, but there are a few things that are relatively constant. For instance, anytime you have a game object selected, anything here inside your scene, you're always going to see the name. You're always going to have access to a tag and a layer, which is something we'll talk about in another video. You're always going to have access to things like the transforms for it, so it's going to need its position, rotation, and scale and space. And if it has any components bolted onto it, then you'll see all of those listed off as well as all of their properties, which again kind of comes back to the nature of the context sensitivity, because all of that will change based on what components are attached to this particular game object.
Correct.
However, the inspector is not here to show you only game objects.
Correct. It'll actually show you settings that you can adjust for your project itself.
Right. So if we go under the Edit menu and jump down to our project settings and grab any one of these, let's say over to Audio. Now we get some properties that affect the project itself and how it handles audio. So you can think of your inspector kind of like a generic properties window that is always going to update depending on what it is you're doing at the time. One other thing I will mention that is really useful is the ability to lock the inspector. So for instance, I can grab this prefab of our camp, and then I can lock the inspector if I want to, and grab anything else, say like this part of the first-person controller, and notice the inspector did not update. So if you need to look at one thing and then update something else, so here's a really cool way where this could come in handy. Here inside of our prefab, we have our fire, which you can see here, and among the particle systems that are making that fire possible, we have the inner core particle system, which is pumping out these little tiny yellowish particles. Now, the little blue highlights that are coming out of that are a little bit distracting. And let's just say, just for sake of argument, that we didn't want those blue wireframes to be visible. Well, we could, while we have that selected, lock the inspector and then select anything else. It doesn't even really matter what. Maybe grab, say, the flame object. We need something that'll keep it playing. So let's go back to our inner core. And then if I switch over to the flame from there, we will maintain that playback, but we'll lose that blue wire frame. And then we can come in here and start making changes to the particle system, where if we hadn't locked the inspector, we'd now be looking at the properties for the flame object. Now, the only thing I will throw out there is if you do this, remember to unlock the inspector, because it's real easy to forget that and then end up accidentally adjusting the properties on something you didn't mean to. So if you do end up locking it, remember, unlock it when you're finished. So again, that's just a quick rundown of the inspector. It's going to change a lot. So you can't really get too used to how it looks at any given time, depending on what you have selected. Again, there are some constants.
Right. As you work with it, you'll get used to all the windows for each of the components, because the components that you bolt onto your game objects all have a set of parameters, and you'll get comfortable with those individuals or the individual components themselves. So if you're working with a lot of game objects, you'll recognize certain things like the collider component, the mesh component. Mm-hmm. So it becomes familiar, but it takes practice.
That's right. And I mean, if you are a Maya user, I mean, I know I am, this is analogous to your attribute editor, which is always context sensitive and will change a lot based on what you have selected. If you just remember that this is where all your properties are hiding when you have something selected, you're good to go. And that is going to wrap things up for this video. Thanks a lot.